During World War I, a squad of British soldiers headed by Lieutenant Turner are fighting the Germans in a trench. When Lieutenant Turner arrives, Private Lewis, Private Gray, and Lance Corporal Walker are resting in the trench. He chastises them for slacking off while the conflict is still going on and advises them to keep an eye out for their foes outside. Later, Captain Hall, Private Segura, and Private Baker of the United States join the trench. Captain Hall offers Lieutenant Turner his aid, sending their new recruits, Segura and Baker, to assist their squad. Private Segura is a medic who seldom carries a rifle, whereas Private Baker is a young and inexperienced soldier. Lieutenant Turner, on the other hand, is disdainful, refusing the Americans' assistance right once. Captain Hall then responds that the order was issued by Major General Allen. He is also requesting a report on their present position from Lieutenant Turner. Lieutenant Turner follows Captain Hall to his improvised office, where he informs Hall that both the British and Germans have exhausted their supplies and are simply waiting for each other to starve. Just afterwards, Private Lewis enters the office, reporting that the German forces have obviously withdrawn because their outpost is deserted. Lieutenant Turner fires an explosive but receives no reaction, ensuring that the Germans have vanished. Gray, meantime, becomes acquainted with Segura and Baker. Gray offers them a drink as a hardened British soldier who has seen combat. Gray tries to terrify the soldiers by telling them about no man's land, which consists of innumerable trenches and tunnels utilized and abandoned throughout the conflict. He playfully tells the two incoming American troops to keep a watchful eye on their surroundings. On the same day, Lieutenant Turner calls a conference with his whole military unit, which includes Private Gray, Private Lewis, Lance Corporal Walker, and others. Private Baker, Private Segura, and Captain Hall. Lieutenant Turner declares that the Germans have retreated, allowing them to cross and take their trench. Captain Hall, on the other hand, is unsure, urging that they use additional weaponry on the Germans first, just to be sure. Despite his caution, Lieutenant Turner is certain that they must go and orders his troops to follow him as they cross. The men crawl on the dirt slowly until they approach the German trench. Baker comes upon a German soldier on his journey. Baker kills the German soldier to stop him from making any disturbance, but he is horrified by his first death. The team is astonished to discover that the trench has been abandoned when they examine it. They also see that the German bunker's entrance has been shut from the outside. Despite their uncertainty, the team gently opens the door and enters the bunker. The German bunker is dark and stinks on the inside. The team avoids a tripwire by using their lantern to see into the darkness. Lieutenant Turner cuts the cable, allowing them to go safely. They subsequently discover the light switch in the bunker and are astonished to see a dying German soldier nailed and chained to a crucifix. Lieutenant Turner's orders were followed. The German soldier, eventually identified as Kurt, is lowered from the cross. He requests that Segura take to Kurt's wounds so that they may interview Kurt on what happened to the bunker. The entrance to the German bunker is attacked and poison gas is dumped inside as the unit prepares to escape with Kurt. Lieutenant Turner and his platoon are trapped within the bunker after the entrance closes. The troops rush to another room and quickly put on masks to protect themselves from the toxic gas. Gray, on the other hand, is killed as a result of the explosion. Lewis tries to get Gray out of the rubble but fails as the deadly gas spreads. He is then compelled to leave Gray and assist Segura in keeping the smoke from entering the other room. Lieutenant Turner explores the area with Lewis and Baker as the gas dissipates, and they discover Gray's lifeless body. Simultaneously, Segura treats Walker's wound from being stabbed by a sharp instrument. Following their quick inspection, Lieutenant Turner orders Lewis and Baker to take up Walker's communication responsibilities with the British station. Lieutenant Turner looks at Gray and grabs his dog tag before returning. Later, Hitler summons Kurt and questions him about being a traitor to his nation. Kurt, on the other hand, keeps silent and refuses to answer any of Lieutenant Turner's queries. Segura, on the other hand, is excavating a tunnel beneath the main door to construct an escape route. He sees inscriptions on a poison gas shell casing and deduces that the Germans had bombed their own station. Segura also observes a strange white liquid trickling from the bunker's ceiling. Lewis exposes himself to be a religious zealot inside their improvised communications room when he encourages Baker to pray with him. When they hear a frequency from Walker's jacket, they say a little prayer for Gray. Lewis attempts to communicate with them. Outpost to request assistance. Meanwhile, Walker is recuperating from his wounds but is suffering from an unbearable itch all over his body. Walker begins to sever his flesh in an attempt to ease the itch. Lewis notices Walker and attempts in vain to stop him from further injuring himself. Lieutenant Turner and the rest of the battalion arrive shortly after to halt Walker. Baker is taken aback when he sees Walker and decides to leave the communications room. He comes into a mass cemetery filled with dead German troops. Immediately withdrawing, Segura comes upon Baker alone and sympathizes with him. Segura convinces Baker that he must overcome his anxiety, even if he is a rookie, since they are at war. Walker has calmed down and is sleeping comfortably in the communications room, with Lewis keeping an eye on him. Lewis apologizes to Lieutenant Turner as he enters the room for failing to save Gray. Gray, Lewis believes, would have done more for the regiment if he were still alive. Lieutenant Turner soothes Lewis just as he bursts into tears. He pushes Lewis to be more brave for the sake of their survival before allowing him to rest for the time being. Walker gets up and approaches Lewis while he is asleep. Kurt notices Walker but remains silent. Walker turns on his buddies, slashing Lewis' leg with a shovel and attempting to assault the other troops. Walker then begins vomiting white viscous material and a little squid-like thing, scaring everyone in the room. Walker steps back and collapses senseless on the ground as soon as he is finished. Segura examines Walker and verifies that he is not breathing. They then bury Walker and the other troops in a mass grave. Segura returns to the communication room and hears a voice over the radio. He recounts their position, and their contact informs them that a rescue squad will be dispatched to their area. Their contact also orders Segura to keep Kurt safe since he is a priority, but does not explain why. Segura walks up to Lieutenant Turner, who is busily repairing the hole. Segura notifies the lieutenant of his radio chat, but instead is chastised for using the radio without authorization. Lieutenant Turner goes insane and fires Segura, despite the fact that Lewis was not on duty when their contact arrived. Lieutenant Turner soon recognizes that he is not being himself and chooses to take a break. He orders Segura to have their prisoner, Kurt, continue digging. Segura keeps an eye on Kurt while writing in his diary for a time. Kurt observes him and inquires as to whom he is writing. Segura responds by saying that he is writing for the community. He reveals that he formerly taught medicine. He also informs Kurt that he volunteered to fight in the war because he felt obligated to contribute. Later, Segura brings up Walker's weird white fluid and questions Kurt about it. Kurt compares man to a sheep who gets himself into trouble when he is left alone. However, there is a devil who disguises himself as a shepherd. Lewis and Baker are assessing the bunker's remaining food supplies in another chamber. Lewis briefly communicates his feelings of worthlessness in their unit, insisting on having a reason to go home. Suddenly, Lewis and Baker realize that all of the remaining food supplies contain the same white fluid and cannot be ingested. Lewis informs Lieutenant Turner of this and attempts to persuade him to turn to God because everything in the bunker is tied to the gospel. Lieutenant Turner, on the other hand, thinks that they must concentrate their efforts on digging the hole in order to escape as quickly as possible. He encourages Lewis to remain sensible, reminding him that they only have each other to rely on. Lieutenant Turner is skeptical about Kurt. Their German prisoner, as well as the American troops in their unit, were taken prisoner. Lewis returns to the communications room after their conversation and reads his Bible while touching the squid-like thing. In the meanwhile, Kurt, Baker, and Segura take turns excavating the hole. Segura discovers odd white roots coming out of the earth while he is alone. A loud noise worries the soldiers, who mistake it for a gas leak. Lieutenant Turner is enraged when they find it was a false alarm. All of a sudden, he accuses Segura of conniving with Kurt to get inside the bunker. Lewis successfully prevents Lieutenant Turner from accidentally stabbing Segura with a knife. He appears to come to his senses, apologizes to Segura, and instructs Baker to return Kurt to digging. Lieutenant Turner points his knife towards Baker, who is stunned and unable to move. Segura interrupts, stating that he is ill, but Lieutenant Turner tells him not to question his judgments or his authority. Because of their previous fight, the tension within the bunker continues to increase over time. The military unit's men have slowly turned against one another, fueled by distrust. As the two Americans forge an alliance with Kurt, Segura picks up a firearm for protection and instructs Baker to remain with him. Baker says he feels like a prisoner inside the bunker as the three of them take a break from excavating. He believes it is impossible for them to escape the bunker alive, given how Lieutenant Turner and Lewis are behaving oddly. Segura, on the other hand, is steadfast. He tells Baker to concentrate and think that they can get out of the bunker. When Segura comes over the tripwire that had been severed, they resume digging. He conceals it from Baker and the rest of the men by covering the wire with sand. Lieutenant Turner sharpens his knife silently in the next room. Meanwhile, Lewis receives an update from their point of contact. Lewis is unsure how long he and the other troops can survive within the bunker. Their contact tells Lewis not to give up hope and to become the one who leads their unit to salvation. Lewis sits silently, immersed in meditation. Lieutenant Turner is informed that the rescue squad is already on its way to assist them. Lieutenant Turner then orders Lewis to gather enough weapons to protect themselves. Lieutenant Turner later convenes a conference with Kurt and the other troops, Segura and Baker. He addresses their existing conflict, pushing them to put it behind them. Lieutenant Turner disarms himself and encourages the other soldiers to do the same for the sake of their partnership. He also reminds them that he is still the highest-ranked authority in the bunker and that they should respect his judgment. Furthermore, Lieutenant Turner warns them to be aware of the rescue squad that will be arriving to save them. Following Lieutenant Turner, Segura, Baker, and Kurt lay their blades on the ground. Lewis returns to the communications room after the meeting. He gathers the white liquid raining from the ceiling and drinks it from a cup, unbeknownst to everyone. Lieutenant Turner has directed Kurt to remain on the corner while Segura and Baker continue to dig. Segura learns that they are getting near to the trench walls after a period of digging. He climbs into the hole and continues to fracture the wall until he comes upon another cluster of white roots. When Segura tries to pluck the roots, he discovers that they are sprouting from a dead body. Just suddenly, the walls surrounding the hole start to disintegrate. Segura retrieves the corpse's tag and crawls out of the hole in time. He checks the dog tag and discovers that the deceased was Captain Hall. Kurt looks attentively at his miniature figure. A childhood recollection of him approaching towards an unknown thing with the identical figurine comes across his mind. Baker and Segura, on the other hand, are weary. The walls surrounding the pit have fallen, and they understand that all of their efforts in excavating have been in vain. As Baker walks away, Segura notices a section of the ceiling covered with white roots. Baker interrupts him as he stares intently at the ceiling. Baker motions for Segura to follow him to the opposite side of the bunker, where Lewis is holding Lieutenant Turner prisoner. Lewis also takes a tiny explosive with him with the intent of killing the lieutenant. While Segura and Baker attempt to calm Lewis, Lewis states his opinion that there is no greater authority other than God. He begins to pray, but Baker intervenes and attempts, but fails, to reattach the pin to the explosive. Lieutenant Turner is able to get away from Lewis just as the bomb goes off. Lewis, on the other hand, is killed. He apologizes to Lieutenant Turner and insists that he simply did it to make him proud. Just before he dies, Lieutenant Turner tells Lewis that he is proud of him. He looks at Lewis, puzzled, as his corpse rots away. Baker panics when he notices one of his hands has been severed on the corner. Segura goes to Baker's aid, covering his wound with a handkerchief. He dashes to the communication room, where their contact appears to be attempting to contact them. Segura answers the radio, requesting emergency aid. Their contact responds that they will be unable to reach them on time unless they can ensure Kurt's safety. Segura asks Kurt's significance to them, but the contact does not respond. Segura grows skeptical of their communication as a consequence. Kurt enters the room shortly after and fires at the radio, which turns out to be spouting the same white viscous liquid. Segura snatches Kurt's gun and continues to shoot at the radio. He turns on the military radio, only to discover that it is being controlled by a squid-like thing at all times. Segura then understands they were duped, and that there would be no rescue squad to assist them. He examines the wires behind the radio, which exposed the same white roots he's observed around the bunker. Segura, desperate for answers, aims the pistol at Kurt and demands that he explain what is going on. Kurt ultimately discloses the name of the mystery thing in the German bunker, the Angel of War. Kurt describes the Angel of War as a black guardian who is dead, deathless, condemned, and fallen. Kurt goes on to say that the Angel of War is everything terrible and exists to eat everything good in a person. On the other hand, it needs a vessel to survive and can only exist in conflict. Meanwhile, the Angel of War infiltrates the troops and causes them to turn on one another. It is the devil, disguised as a shepherd, to whom he was referring previously. Kurt then admits that he is nothing more than a lamb who is reliant on the curse of such an entity. Segura asks Kurt how to stop the Angel of War, but to his surprise, Kurt says nothing. He realizes that it is unstoppable. Lieutenant Turner has gone mad about the same time, as he begins mumbling to himself. He then notices white liquid trickling on his men. The liquid continues to splatter on Lieutenant Turner until he begins to soak in it. Lieutenant Turner is soon overtaken by his own darkness, as he begins to blame Segura for the deaths of his British comrades. He sees Segura with Kurt and labels him a traitor for collaborating with their adversary. Lieutenant Turner shoots Kurt, causing him to tumble to the ground, sparking a brawl. Baker appears and assaults Lieutenant Turner from behind, knocking him unconscious. Lieutenant Turner is pushed to the ground by Segura, and the two fight viciously. Lieutenant Turner spots a dagger and stabs Segura with it. He walks away triumphantly, just as the bunker's walls begin to break apart. Lieutenant Turner discovers a hole above the white roots as he looks up at the ceiling. Baker looms behind him, and he gives out a nasty chuckle. Baker continues to shoot Lieutenant Turner until he dies. Soon later, Segura awakens and discovers Kurt unconscious. He retrieves his bag and attempts to treat Kurt's injuries, but Kurt insists on remaining inside the bunker. When Segura finds the hole in the ceiling, he decides to attend to Baker's wounds first. He attempts to reach the ceiling by accumulating a few containers. Segura assists Baker in climbing the ceiling, and the two of them escape the bunker. Baker admits to Segura that he is just 16 years old and that he lied about his age in order to serve in the army. Segura then reassures Baker that he will be okay. Just thereafter, two soldiers come and are able to transport Baker away on a stretcher. Segura, on the other hand, decides to return to the bunker in the hopes of also saving Kurt. To his dismay, he discovers that Kurt has already died and that his corpse has rotted entirely. Segura detects a light circle emerging from within Kurt's body. He is drawn to it, until he has a vision of himself being enveloped by a cloud of smoke. Segura encounters a small child within a trunk formed of white roots. As Segura is pushed into the trunk, he awakens and encounters the evil monster known as the Angel of War. The thing, which appears to be made of black roots, approaches him slowly. Segura begins to vomit white liquid as he continues to resist. Segura resolves to murder himself along with the demonic creature after realizing he is about to be engulfed by it. Finally, Segura creeps to a tripwire he saw earlier and pulls it hard, causing an explosion that destroys the whole bunker. Segura's diary lies on the ground outside the bunker, becoming encrusted with earth. Despite being released in 2022, the film succeeds in recapturing the traditional feel of horror films. This is visible throughout the film, from the opening and closing titles to the music soundtrack. On the other side, the film is relatively slow-paced and has a propensity to lose viewers' attention halfway through. It took much too long to reach the climax, just to be met with a predictable and somewhat illogical conclusion. Furthermore, the film's major adversary has been misrepresented. There is no clear evidence of who the Angel of War is. Nonetheless, it is worth noting that the picture has a lot of promise and that many aspects might have been done better. Rather than focusing on the horror genre, it may be better described as a psychological thriller due to the emphasis on character development rather than storyline.